Apologies for starting a little bit late, and first, thank you all for coming out. My name is Andrea. I'm with the International Socialist Organization. I'm going to be chairing tonight's meeting. On October 27th, or I'm sorry, December 27th, Israel began a vicious campaign against the residents of Gaza, as I'm sure everybody here is well aware. Thankfully, we saw an immediate response worldwide in the form of protest against Israel. The first time we've seen a response quite as large as what we saw ever in the history of Israel's existence. Despite the fact that an official ceasefire has been declared, I, for one, am not really okay, or I'm not ready to accept just a return to the status quo, which includes a complete lockdown on Gaza and pretty much all of occupied Palestine. So we're here tonight to discuss both the recent events in Israel-Palestine, but also to figure out how we can effectively fight against what's been going on. And I think some of the protests that we've seen both here in the United States and internationally start to kind of lead us towards what we can be saying and doing to demand an end to the violence. So tonight we're lucky enough to have 4 speakers. And I'm just going to do a quick round of introductions and then turn it over to them. First, we have Waddah Sofan, who is currently working on his master's degree in conflict resolution here at PSU, and has recently co-founded the group Students United for Palestinian Equal Rights. He has firsthand experience of the occupation and is a valuable resource on campus who fights for the rights of ethnic minorities as well as the disabled. Hala Gores, an attorney in Portland whose family immigrated from Palestine when she was 10, is a PSU alumnus, well known for her local activism with Americans United for Palestinian Human Rights, and brings her analysis of the political situation in Israel and Palestine. Adam Sanchez is a member of the International Socialist Organization and ILWU Local 5, a leader in the local anti-war movement, and a tireless fighter for economic and social justice. He will speak to the political climate in the United States and what the possibilities are for struggle. And Jenka Soderberg is founder of the Oregon Campaign to Boycott and Divest from Israel. She has volunteered in Palestine as an independent journalist and currently works with Portland's own KBOO Community Radio. She will talk to us about the boycott and divestment campaign. So each of these folks is going to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up and have a period for questions, discussion. When we get there, I'll give a little bit more of an explanation of how we'll run that. But with that, I'm just going to turn it over so our speakers have the most time that they can. Waddah?
Thank you very much, everyone, for having me here. It's my fault. Can you guys hear me? Can you guys hear me?
It's better. It's closer to your mouth.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here today, in front of a crowd, in front of wonderful speakers, Hala, Adam, and Jenka. I will start with my early experience in the conflict, my early childhood. I remember when I was 9 years old, my dad took me to a place which is strange for me. He took me to a place where he born. It was in Syria, or the Palestinian city called Nationality Law. He showed me where he born, where his mom gave the birth for him. It's a beautiful land. It's a beautiful house with the orange and lemon trees around. It's on the beach. But we can't have it anymore. It's not ours. I know my dad, on the way back, he showed me the deeds that we owe that land. But because of the 1948 war, he'd been forced to end in West Bank as a refugee. So to be a refugee in your own land, that's strange. The Palestinians expelled in 1948 and also in 1967 in the surrounding countries, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. But my experience as a child bring awareness about the occupations and the conflict in the Middle East. So when I get back home, I start seeing soldiers on the street with guns. I wake up on the tear gas, smelling the tear gas and the sound of bullets. House has been demolished. Friends been arrested. Neighbors been shot at. So the more you grow up with violence around you. you have a trauma. So you have no choice. What's the choice you have when you grow up in such under occupation with violence? You have to go on the street and protest. Non-violent protest, non-violent resistance, carrying a sign, throwing rocks. Rocks is not going to hurt anybody, but the rocks tell the whole world that there's a Palestinians still exist and they are under the occupations which Israel tried to wipe them out of the earth. We have the First Uprising. I have the honor to be one of the people who went to the street to protest. As every Palestinian, my story is similar. I have my friend Said as well. He got shot by Israelis. Joining the people on the street, getting arrested, being in jail, tortured, then get released, then get in jail back again, until the first Intifada came, when everybody went out the street in 1987. People went to the street to refuse the occupations, to end the occupations, to ask for resolutions to the Palestinian question, to ask the United Nations to apply the United Nations resolutions and demand Israel to withdraw fully from West Bank and Gaza to the 1948 border. The United Nations blocked its ears and closed its eyes toward the Palestinian people. So the Palestinian people have no choice but to go to the street. We lost a lot of innocent people, a lot of civilians, kids. I can go back more to the First Uprising and the Second Uprising, but I would like to talk mostly about the Gaza invasion. From my experience, I know that the United States aiming to the new Middle East concept. The Middle East that forced Israel to control the whole economic and to control the economic of the Middle East. And we saw that very clear in Annapolis, bringing all the Arab leaders to agree for normalization with Israel on the expense of the Palestinians. The Palestinian state never was a question or never brought on the table. Israel took advantage by shaking hands with the Arab leaders to compromise more and more and more. The new Middle East was proposed by the United States was clearly when Israel attacked Hezbollah. It was impossible to achieve the new Middle East with having some obstacle like Hezbollah and Hamas. They tried in Lebanon, they killed a lot of innocent people, but Hezbollah is still in power. They tried with Hamas in Gaza, Hamas is still in power. But the victims are always the civilians. 510 kids were killed. And we're talking only about kids. Israel used a massive power, plated uranium, phosphoric bombs, a weapon which never had been used before. The Palestinians were being tested with those guns. I came to the United States in 1996. Being disabled after I got shot by Israelis. I decided to stay in this country because of the American Disability Act. I feel so independent. I can achieve a lot to help my people. I went to school. I get my computer science degree, undergrad, but that is not who I am. That's why I switched to conflict resolutions during my graduate degree. Something I feel passionate toward, something I want to share my experience and story with the Americans. Something the Americans, they don't hear on the news. joining the conflict resolution despite being shot at. I'm open to all options. We are Palestinians, are very hospitable, very welcoming people. I'm very forgiving. I've been shot at. If the soldiers came over who shot me and he want to start a new beginning, I have no problem. I don't hate him. He's victimized, like me. With the Zionist concept bringing the whole Jew to Israel, or to the Palestinian occupied land, it's propaganda, it's misleading, it's brainwash for the Jew to end in Palestine. Zionists create the concept of the promised land, the honey and milk land, force the Jew to end in Palestine. And the indigenous people been driven out because of the Zionist concept. We lived pre-Zionist existence, pre-Israel, 60 years ago, 64 years ago. We were Jew, Muslim, Christians, live in peace and harmony. We never fought about land. We shared everything we had. We were a very collective society. Our main goal is to farm and live on our harvest. Western Jew came to the Middle East with the individualistic ideas, capitalist ideas, consuming ideas, the greedy ideas, taking the land. They've been victimized by the Nazis. They've been treated badly by the Nazis in Germany. But we Palestinians, it's not our fault to be treated the same way they've been treated. We pay the United Nations mistakes. The whole nations feel guilty toward the Jew. I joined the conflict resolution program to find an alternative choice, alternative solutions to the Palestinians' questions. I support the idea of having one state for multi-ethnic or multiple ethnic groups who live in Palestine. You cannot achieve one nation state unless you provide social, economic justice for everybody, Christian, Muslims, and Jew. Live in peace and harmony, share the wealth. The conflict resolution concept should be brought to the early ages, to the early generations, between both. But to start a conflict resolution concept, you have to work on healing and reconciliation and healing process. You have to restore justice. Restoring justice would be by bringing the immigrants, the refugees back to their homelands. Whoever wish to go back or get compensations based on the United Nations Resolution 198. You know, we are not talking about the suffering and the pain and the loss. We lost a lot of money, buildings, you can call it material things. It's not just we lost our souls and suffering. 64 years being displaced. My dad experienced from Jaffa to West Bank. My experience from West Bank to America. This is the life of the Palestinians, jumping from place to place. Try to find hope and share their stories with the international community, hoping one day the international community will give us justice and listen. Bringing the concept resolutions in the Middle East, it's a good idea. We have to build a trust between the two multi-ethnic groups. We have to look at our historical path, historical narrative. It's just, the key issue is what and how is acknowledgement and denial, and how stories are told and retold. So So we have, the Jew, they have a historical narrative, and the Palestinians have a historical narrative. I believe we all share pain, but our historical narrative is caused by the Jew, by the Zionists, with respect to the Jew as individuals. I believe it's possible for two people to live under one nation. But this concept is not very welcomed by the Israeli government right wing. Maybe the lefties will take the idea. Because that's mean to Israel is destruction of Israel. The demographic among the Palestinians are increasing, the number increased, and Israel sees it as a threat. I will stop here, and I'll answer any question you guys have, and I will pass the mic to Hala. Thank you.
I'm not sure I need a mic. Anybody back there that can't hear me? Raise a hand. Yeah, I don't know that I really need to, so if anybody can't hear me, just go ahead and stand up and I'll try to use the mic. It's difficult following Waddah because he's soft-spoken, and his story about his life is, like many Palestinians, gut-wrenching. And I was given the difficult task to address a bit of the historical aspect of what we are talking about here today. And the difficulty in that is that I'm not a historian, I'm a trial lawyer. But I know my people's history, and I know my own family's history. So I'll start by telling you that I was born in Nazareth inside the Green Line in 1963 to a father who is Roman Catholic and a mother who is Greek Orthodox. The Palestinians comprised of Christians, Muslims, and Jews. That is something that has been buried in terms of the historical aspect of who we were as Palestinian people. The majority being Muslim, the minority being Christians and Jews, a small minority. One of the things I want to talk about, it occurred to me that I'm here to talk about the occupation and the evils of the occupation. And it also occurred to me that we're not just talking about the occupation of a people, we're also talking about the Israeli occupation of the U.S. mainstream media, the Israeli occupation of the U.S. Congress. I want to start calling it a Knesset. It's no longer a U.S. Congress. So getting back to the historical aspect and the peoples that live together, one of the myths or distortions, lies that you hear is that this is a conflict that has been going on for centuries. This is so complex, these people can't get along. And the idea behind it is, this is not a solvable conflict. And so, the pro-Zionist, the Christian Zionist, the right wing will throw out these ideas that this is a conflict that has gone on for centuries when it has not. The other part of it that started long ago in terms of myths is this idea that this land was a land without a people for a people without a land. What a romantic concept. Problem is, there were over 1 million Palestinians living in the area. Okay, well that's a distortion that has been sold hook, line, and sinker until the Palestinians started complaining. So going back to, I have a table over there. A lot of what's on it came from If Americans Knew. If anybody has pen and paper and doesn't know about If Americans Knew, look them up. It's ifamericansknew.org. And everything on that table you can feel free to take. If you have a donation for them, that's perfectly fine. If you don't, that's perfectly fine. What you will see is this card that shows loss of Palestinian land prior to the UN partition, prior to 1948, with the UN Partition Plan, and then from 1948 to 1967, and then 2000 and this comes to 2005, but it's consistent with what's happening today. Now, this card says it all in terms of the history of what has happened to the Palestinian people, because this card shows you in green that the Palestinians that lived in Palestine, you see them here in green, and you will see it is the vast majority of historical Palestine. You will also see that in white were the Jewish Palestinian population. They were citizens of Palestine under British rule, under Ottoman rule, and yet they were Palestinian citizens, but Jews. What you had is an immigration into Palestine that was so horrific in terms of its numbers that I don't understand how anybody looking at it would say, you know, if a few 100,000 people wanted to move into Portland and they were right-wingers, they were here to steal our homes, they were here to steal our stores, they were here to, and if we would think that would be okay with us, I want you to stand up because you've got an explanation for me. Okay? It's exactly what happened in Palestine in terms of the immigration. And what Waddah talks about is spot on in terms of why are we as Palestinians having to pay for the crimes of the West? Where was America while the Jews in Europe were getting killed? Where were the rest of the European countries at the beginning of the slaughter? We had nothing to do with it, but we were made to pay the price. Okay, well that takes us to the UN Partition Plan that's in this card, and the Partition Plan called for 55% of the land to end up with the Jews, mostly new immigrants, and 45% of historical Palestine to end up with for the Palestinians. If anybody thinks that's acceptable, that's another explanation that I would like to talk about and deserve. It was not acceptable, but the Haganah, the military force of what was prior to the existence of the State of Israel, prior to the so-called IDF, you had the Haganah, and the forces in the Haganah had gone throughout Palestine committing atrocities, committing terror acts. And I have personal stories about those atrocities and terror acts. My own family, my father's family, was in Haifa at the time. One half the family, some brothers, decided to go back to Nazareth. The rest decided it would be safer to go up to Beirut for just a couple of weeks. They have been in those refugee camps in Beirut since 1948. With the exception, interestingly enough, of two young boys, teenagers in 1948, who went up with my dad's uncles. Their mother, a widow, was in Nazareth, and when she heard that her boys had left to another country, she borrowed the neighbor's donkey and started walking. It took her days. At the borders were closed. With the establishment of the State of Israel, the military explained to her that if she wanted to leave, she was certainly free to, but she was not going to come back. She didn't pay heed. She kept walking. She went, and I remember as a child she told me this story. She grabbed one boy by one ear and grabbed the other boy by the other ear, demanding to know why they would leave and not come back to Nazareth, and she walked back. And at the border, they stopped her with the weapons. And she said to them, shoot me. Shoot me. And for whatever reason, they didn't. So back in 1948, my dad's uncle and her two boys effected the right of return, which is a right every Palestinian has under international law. So what we have is 1948 historical Palestine, 78% of it ends up with the Zionists, and the establishment of the State of Israel is created. There is one book that I would highly recommend that everybody read, if you haven't already, It is called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Israeli historian Ilan Pappé. He wrote about the ethnic cleansing, starting with how the plan was with the Haganah leaders, the Jewish leaders that had been there, the Zionists, who decided that the only way they could have a Jewish state is to force out the population. And this was a plan that was written in Ben-Gurion's, referred to in Ben-Gurion's memos, in his letters, and he talks about it, he called it Plan Dalet. So this plan was to forcibly kick out village after town, through killing, massacres. Deir Yassin, most people know about. Other massacres occurred. And the purpose of the massacres, intentional, the purpose of the massacres was to drive the people out, to scare them away. I met a woman when I went in 2004 to the refugee camps in Lebanon. She was probably mid-60s or so. I didn't ask her age, but she said that when she left Palestine, she was 8 years old, so you can do the math. I can't, that's why I went to law school. She was 8 years old, and she was from a little village in the north. And when her family heard about the killing and the raping of women and girls, she said her mother started picking up the mud off the ground and putting it all over her face. She was such a pretty girl that her mother was afraid she would get raped. And so she muddied her face up, and they walked to Lebanon for safety. And they haven't been back to Palestine since, or to Israel. I'm sure they'd be happy to go back either way. I want to focus on Gaza. I mean, in terms of the history, I'll go through it. Cliff's Notes version. 1988, the PLO decides to accept the two-state solution, and they go and shake hands with the Israeli government leaders, and they say, okay, now we can have a two-state solution. Didn't happen. And it didn't happen because it was never, ever the plan of Israeli leaders to have peace with the Palestinians. Let me correct that. They would have peace with us if we all left. Okay? If we gave up our lands, we gave up our resources, they would have peace with us. We're not willing to do that. So 1988, Abu Ammar, Yasser Arafat, and all these guys go back in and they shake hands and they say, okay, we'll get the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, and you get 78% of historical Palestine, and is that okay? It wasn't okay. Ehud Barak comes back and he says, well, what I want to do is make sure that you have no contiguous borders. You cannot have a border with Jordan. You cannot have a border with Egypt. We, Israel, the military, will control your borders. We want to make sure that we annex all of the settlements. We want to make sure that we control your airspace. We want to make sure we control what goes in and what goes out. Therefore, no sovereignty. So Fatah and the rest failed miserably in terms of their dealings with Israel. Comes Hamas. Okay? I'm a Christian Palestinian. My father, 3 years ago, went back home. He goes back every 2 years. He went back 3 years ago. And he was at Ben Gurion Airport, leaving. At age 75, they had him sit there at Ben Gurion Airport, stark naked. They forced him to strip down, stark naked. My father is not political. My father has never been to a demonstration in his life. He sat there for 2 hours, and then this young military guy comes to him and says, get your clothes on. And my father looked up and he said, I come to my country every 2 years to visit my family and see our homes. And I come in peace. This time, I leave supporting Hamas. How is it that this occupation, that this treatment of people can cause a man who is a true Christian or believer to say such things? It's because of the occupation. So Hamas wins elections. And they win elections that are cleaner than elections we have had in this country. Carter went there as an observer and said the elections were fair, they were clean, no corruption. So they win. What's the response of the West? What's the response of Israel? They will collectively punish the people for voting their choice. So we fast forward to Gaza. 1.5 million Palestinian people, 1/2 of whom are children. Israel, the West, wants to collectively punish 1/2 of 1.5 million Palestinians, 1/2 of whom are children. How do they collectively punish them? No medicine, no access to treatment, no food. There was talk of causing these Palestinians to see the light by putting them on a diet. You limit their food, you limit their fuel. Somebody gets an education, a scholarship for an education, you don't let them go. It's happened again and again and again. And what boggles my mind is that this is so counterproductive to what the right wing in the US and what the right wing in Israel want, that I either have to think they are stupid or crazy, because it is so counterproductive. They can't break down the Palestinian people. So now I need to wrap it up. I will tell you, in terms of focusing on Gaza, since 2006, the Gazans have lived under the most atrocious conditions possible. All you have to do is Google the situation and see what's going on in the West Bank. I want to get back to, in terms of occupying the media. So Israel gets this message out that all these rockets are being lobbed on us, all these rockets are being lobbed on us, we have no choice but to defend ourselves. Okay? And what do we hear here in the US? Mainstream media basically mimics what they're given, fed by the Israelis. And they say, yes, we have to, they have a right to defend themselves. Well, if I'm standing in line next to you at the grocery store and you bump me and you do it intentionally, do I have the right to take out an Uzi and shoot you? No, you don't have that kind of right to a self-defense. So the lies that are being fed to the US media, I want you to pay special attention to, because what you will find on the If Americans Knew table over there is how Israel has violated this most current ceasefire in just the last few days 7 times. That's something that's not reported by the Israeli-occupied US media. That Israel went in the beginning of November and killed 6 Hamas militants, violating the ceasefire. That's something that's not much reported by the Israeli-occupied US media. So I am out of time, and I am really sorry because I'm supposed to go over more of the historical aspect of Gaza, but maybe we can get to it in Q&A.
I want to start by really thanking everyone for speaking on this panel. I think this subject in particular is very difficult to speak out about in the United States. There's possibly nowhere else in the world, I would include Israel in that, where it is as difficult. You read the Israeli press, and you can get a lot of information about what Israel's aims are, what they are doing. I mean, this is not anti-Semitic propaganda. This is simply a reading of Haaretz. There's a special history, as Hala alluded to, between the United States and Israel. And if you don't understand that, you can't understand why there is silence and systematic disinformation about Israel today in this country. That's why people, I think, really should check out the literature table we have in the back. The Struggle for Palestine is an excellent introduction to this issue. It's a series of essays by a number of writers. There's a number of books, as well as Amira Haas's book back there, and a couple other books that will give a really good introduction to this issue. Now, I want to turn back to what has happened in the last few weeks. And I think we can all say that fortunately, Israel's massacre of Gaza was not the only thing in the news, because hundreds of thousands of people across the world took to the streets and to fight back against the occupation of Palestine. 20,000 people gathered across from the White House on January 10th to denounce Israel's war on Gaza and to demand an end to U.S. support for state-sponsored terrorism. The Washington, D.C. demonstration was one in a sea of demonstrations across this country. The next day in New York City, 20,000 people gathered, just a week after a 25,000-person march was organized in a few days. Coast to coast, San Francisco, 7,000, Los Angeles, 5,000, Chicago, 6,000. I can go on and on. And here, thanks to the amazing work of Americans United for Palestinian Human Rights, we had rolling demonstrations numbering from 2 to anywhere to 700 people that were incredibly inspiring. And I think the most striking thing about all these protests, countrywide, is that they were led everywhere by Arab immigrants. And Arab immigrants made up the majority of the protesters as well. The people who were possibly the most oppressed section of the United States population since Bush started this war on terror and began this wave of racist Islamophobic practices in this country, these people were coming out by tens of thousands to say, we will not be silent. And I think that's something to really take into account as we're talking about this. The United States was certainly not the only country to have massive protests. In London, you can see this on YouTube, 50,000 protesters pushed back a police line on their way to the Israeli embassy. And a week later, 100,000 showed up to protest. And it hasn't been just confined to protests either. Right now in Britain, 16 universities are occupied. And they're demanding, the students are occupying and demanding an end to their university's complicity with the Israeli regime and a divestment from Israel. Throughout the Middle East as well, people protested. In Ramallah, hundreds marched to the headquarters of the Palestinian Authority, the largest demonstration there in several years. In Egypt, the country with the largest working class in the region, hundreds of thousands have taken part in protests across the country. And as one Arab writer pointed out to Al Jazeera, Egypt is on the edge of transforming, and the regime there, the Mubarak dictatorship, could be toppled as a result of this. I think that's really incredible to take in that statement. That thousands more gathered: Beirut, Damascus, Syria, Khartoum, Sudan, Amman, Jordan, and Baghdad in occupied Iraq as well. Actually, my personal favorite was in Ankara, Turkey, where the Israeli basketball team, B'nai Hasharon, had to flee from the court because 4,000 people were marching and chanting outside the arena, and inside a rain of shoes came down from the stands, flying onto the court, and the basketball team had to run off the court into the locker room and ended up having to forfeit the game. Even in Israel, 10,000 people protested in Tel Aviv. One soldier was jailed for over 2 weeks for refusing to fight in Gaza, and this has spurred a new soldiers' resistance movement in Israel called the Refuseniks. Yet there's one place, despite all this, as Hala mentioned, that unfortunately you're not going to hear the slightest bit of criticism, and instead Israel gets words of encouragement, and that is in the halls of the US Congress and in the offices of the president, both old and new, unfortunately. Compared even to the level of criticism of the government in Israel itself, the one-sidedness of the pro-Israel cheerleading here is astounding. Now, if anyone has any questions of where Obama stands on this issue, I think you only need to look to a speech he made in June of this year on the campaign trail after the primary, where he stated, "Those who threaten Israel threaten us. Israel has always faced these threats on the front lines, and I will bring to the White House an unshakable commitment to Israel's security. That starts with ensuring Israel's qualitative military advantage. I will ensure that Israel can defend itself from any threat from Gaza to Tehran. Defense cooperation between the United States and Israel is a model of success, and it must be deepened. As president, I will implement a memorandum of understanding that provides $30 billion in assistance to Israel over the next decade. So what explains the bipartisan support for the Israeli military? It certainly isn't because the American politicians are reflecting the will of the American people. Actually, the polls show that the American people are much more closely divided on this issue. A recent Rasmussen poll found that Americans generally are closely divided over whether the Jewish state should be taking action against militants in the Gaza Strip. 44% to 41%, with 15% undecided. And Democratic voters they overwhelmingly oppose the Israeli offensive by a 24-point margin. So the most popular explanation that's usually given for the American elite's pro-Israel stance is that it fears the wrath of the Israel lobby. Yet in 2008, the American Israeli Political Affairs Committee and its affiliates, AIPAC and its affiliates, it gave only about $2.5 million to various politicians. And by modern standards, this really isn't that much. If you look at the Firefighters Union, for instance, they gave $2.7 million. Organized labor, together completely overwhelms the Israel lobby in the type of the contributions that they give. Yet, organized labor has nothing like the political dominance that Israel advocates have today. Israel is the largest recipient of U.S. aid. It receives $3 billion annually. Egypt runs at a close second with $2 billion annually. But you would never see people seriously argue that Egypt gets that money because of an Egyptian lobby. It's no coincidence. It's no coincidence that Israel and Egypt are the two top recipients of U.S. aid. Both are important U.S. allies in the region where the lion's share of the oil is located, the world's oil. Since the end of the Second World War, the U.S. has tied its national security to its access to and control of the flow of oil. That's why the U.S. has given military and economic aid to prop up friendly states in the region, not only Israel and Egypt, but Jordan and the Gulf monarchies as well. The U.S. puts Israel at the top of the list because its government and population form the only uniformly pro-U.S. state in the region. In countries like Egypt, pro-Western governments rule over populations that hate the U.S. government's support for Israel and for their own oppressive regimes. As long as Israel remains central to U.S. imperialism in the Middle East, Israel will continue to receive U.S. backing and aid, and as long as the national security establishment remains committed to Israel, elected politicians are going to provide the political cover that justifies billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars going over to Israel. That's why U.S. support for Israel's occupation of Palestine cannot be separated from the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan, and must be taken up by the anti-war movement. Not only do they flow from the same plan of U.S.-Israeli domination of the Middle East, but Israel has actually advised the United States on every aspect of the occupations, from training Kurdish militias to the torture at Abu Ghraib. The link between these wars, which is too often, I think, denied by anti-war forces who aren't willing to challenge the Democratic Party, is openly proclaimed in the United States press. Israel is seen as a strategic partner in U.S. efforts to reshape the Middle East, an effort that includes occupying Iraq and Afghanistan, going after Syria and Iran, stabilizing Pakistan, as we see in the headlines now, and smashing Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Palestine. The anti-war movement must link these issues together, Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, and acknowledge that we cannot build a united anti-war movement that fails to take on the issue of Palestine. I want to encourage all of those in the room who have worked on Palestinian rights and the Palestine issue or are thinking about that to join the broader anti-war movement as well, get involved with groups like PDX Peace, like the Campus Anti-War Network, and with supporters like the International Socialist Organization, convince the entire anti-war movement that it can no longer remain silent on the issue of Palestine. The anti-war... I think the anti-war movement must connect the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Palestine and link arms with the Arab community that has come out by the tens of thousands to these protests. Now, I'll wrap up on this because I don't have much time. These protests were not only larger than previous demonstrations in support of the Palestinian struggle, but they were also accompanied, especially in the United States, by a significant increase in polls showing opposition to Israel's attack. I think this proves that protest does matter and can sway public opinion. And I think that's an important point to make, because in 2003, there were massive protests all across the world against the Iraq War. And I think, lo and behold, it didn't stop Bush from going into Iraq and creating a horrible occupation there. And I think the lesson that a lot of people from that was, oh, protest doesn't matter, oh, forget about it, there's nothing we can do, blah, blah, blah. And I think the lesson we should have learned was that one protest doesn't take down an empire. In fact, neither do 5 or 6 or 8 or 10. And I think, quite frankly, we haven't had enough mass protests against these wars in this country. And another thing is that what happens in between those protests is actually of some concern to us. The politicization, the organization, the debates, the panels, the teach-ins, the films, the getting involved with organizations like Students United for Palestinian Equal Rights. This is what needs to happen in between those protests and building the organizations that are out there. I'm really surprised that Portland State University actually doesn't have a chapter of the Campus Anti-War Network. And I think we should start one, and we should work with organizations like Super on the issue of Palestine. And I think it'll be up to activists in the US and elsewhere around the world to seize on this enormous outpouring of sympathy for Israel's victims in Gaza to build a sustained movement against the apartheid conditions facing Palestinians. In the words of Haidar Eid, a Gaza resident who helped to spearhead a call for an international movement to sanction, boycott, and divest from Israel, Israel's attack on Gaza could be the Sharpeville Massacre in 1960, when 69 blacks were killed by the white racist regime of apartheid South Africa. He said in an interview with Socialist Worker last week, the Sharpeville Massacre gave rise to the divestment campaign against apartheid South Africa, which ultimately led to the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990 and his election as the first black president of multicultural, multiracial, secular democratic South Africa as we know it now. Gaza could be the spark that could initiate a different new Middle East than what Condoleezza Rice talked about in 2006. She meant a new Middle East characterized by American-Israeli hegemony. What I'm saying now is that I can see the birth pangs of a new Middle East characterized by the end of despotic, dictatorial, pro-American regimes. And I'm going to end with a recent quote from Ali Abu Nima, who's the co-founder of Electronic Intifada, which is an incredible resource for a news source for the Palestinian struggle. If you haven't checked it out, you definitely should. Because I think in this quote he really captures the essence of what these last few weeks have meant for longtime Palestinian activists. He says, Zionism, an ideology of racial supremacy, extremism, and hate, is a dying project, in retreat and failing to find new recruits. Every new massacre makes it harder, but a de-Zionized, decolonized, reintegrated Palestine affording equal rights to all who live in it, regardless of religion or ethnicity, and return for refugees, is not a utopian dream. It is within reach in our lifetimes, but it is far from inevitable. We can be sure that Western and Arab governments will continue to support Israeli apartheid and Palestinian collaboration under the guise of the peace process unless decisively challenged. Israeli massacres will continue and escalate until the nightmare of an Israeli-style peace, apartheid and further cleansing, ethnic cleansing is fulfilled. The mobilizations of the past 3 weeks showed that a different world is possible and within our grasp if we support the boycott, divestments, and sanctions movement. Although they will never get to see it, that world would be a fitting memorial for all of Israel's victims. And I hope everyone in this room will join us on this panel to fight for that world. Thanks.
Now, in talking about it, the goal of the campaign isn't to boycott. It's to end Israeli apartheid. And so for that reason, we want to be the Oregon campaign to end Israeli apartheid. EndIsraeliApartheid.org is the new website. Not much on there yet, but it's beginning. I myself lived in South Africa soon after apartheid was ended. I was teaching there. My students still had the apartheid history books that literally wrote them out of the history, as the vast majority of the population, as the Native Africans, were literally not a part of the history. And in every aspect of the apartheid system in South Africa, there is an equivalent aspect in Israel, Palestine. Israel is an apartheid state. Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop in South Africa, has repeatedly said that what's happening in Israel and Palestine is worse than what happened in South Africa. And I just want to point out some of the Israeli apartheid laws and then what we can do to pressure Israel. This is not a campaign to destroy Israel. It's a campaign for justice for Israel and the Palestinians, because it will not destroy Israel to give equal rights to their neighbors, to the people that they have occupied. It will be a much better life for both the Israelis and the Palestinians to be able to live in the land, in the Holy Land, side by side. And Palestinians have shown on more than one occasion, many, many, many occasions, that they are willing to do that, to live as neighbors. The problem is the occupation. The apartheid laws have been many. As Hala talked about some of the history, the ethnic cleansing that began in 1948 resulted then in a number of laws that were put into the practice in Israel. The law of return grants a right of immigration to Jews born anywhere in the world to the state of Israel. And the law was extended then to include the grandchild of a Jew, someone who has converted to Judaism, and the spouse of a convert. So all of those, all Jewish people are allowed to immigrate into Israel and are given citizenship rights at the expense of the indigenous population. The Nationality Law in 1952 confers automatic citizenship upon all who immigrate there under the right of return. Population Registry Law in 1965 requires all residents of Israel to register their nationality. And it's interesting, in an Israeli passport, the nationality is not listed as Israeli. It's listed as Jewish. And the people who live inside Israel who are not Jewish, Arabs, Druze, have their nationality listed as Arabs or as Druze. And the Identity Card Law of 1982, all residents must carry identity cards at all times and present them to senior police officers, to the heads of local authorities, or to police officers or soldiers on duties when required to do so. And in fact, there have been incidents of resistance similar to those that took place in South Africa. One of them in Bet Sahor in the first Intifada, where the Palestinian residents threw their identity cards on the ground. And unfortunately, that wasn't then picked up by other towns, and the Israeli military was able to isolate that town, blockade them with massive blockading and break their will. They also engaged in tax resistance. These forms of nonviolent resistance have been a part and parcel of the Palestinian resistance since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. Other apartheid laws, land. In the State of Israel, 90% of the land is owned by the Jewish National Fund. That land is then leased to people who are Jewish for 99-year leases, and that land is is in the hands of the Jewish National Fund. It's not, they don't own a title to that land, the people who live there. What happens is, if they want to move, they can move, but the land, remains in the hands of the Jewish National Fund, and only a Jewish person can move onto that land. So these types of exclusive laws are what we're talking about. And of course, the occupation of all of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So there are Palestinians, 1/5 of the of the population of Israel is Palestinian that have Israeli citizenship. And then there are over 5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And those Palestinians have a second or a third-class citizenship, whereas the Israeli Jews have the first-class citizenship. Israeli Arabs, those who live inside what's called the Green Line, or the 1967 Israeli border that continues to expand and expand, those who live inside are second-class citizens. And those who live in the West Bank and Gaza are in a completely different class altogether. They're living under martial law with absolutely no rights. So all of these laws, the absentee property law, where Palestinians who fled their land have basically given up their land. That if they fled their land as refugees and haven't been able to get back, that land is considered to be abandoned, and the Israeli state takes it over, and it becomes part of the Jewish National Fund. The transfer of property law of 1950 transfers confiscated Palestinian villages and private property to the Development Authority, which is empowered to dispose of it in the interests of the state, giving priority, of course, to the Jewish National Fund. And the World Zionist Organization Law of 1952, which establishes the World Zionist Organization and the Jewish Agency as organizations with governmental status in fulfilling Zionist objectives, i.e. the immigration and settlement of Jews in Palestine. Now, since 1993, that immigration has meant, for the most part, immigration into the illegal settlements or colonies on Palestinian land in the West Bank. The growth of those settlements is 3 times as much as immigration into Israel itself. So that continual expansion of Israeli land. And judicial practice. The Israeli courts, guided by the Supreme Court, have consistently decided that discrimination between Arabs and Jews is legitimate based on the founding principles of Israel as a state for the Jewish people. Nationality or ethnicity, which is how Israel defines nationality, is a legitimate basis for discrimination. In the State of Israel versus Ashgoyaf in 1988, an Israeli settler was convicted by the Tel Aviv District Court of shooting a Palestinian child. The judge sentenced him to a suspended jail term of 6 months and community service. When challenged on that sentence, the trial judge, Ori Schutzman, said, "It is wrong to demand in the name of equality, equal bearing, and equal sentences to 2 offenders who have different nationalities, ethnicities, who break the laws of the state. The sentence that deters the one and his audience does not deter the other and his community," based in racism and discrimination, that type of sentencing. And it occurs time and time and time again. You'll see these settlers that can engage in massive violence against Palestinians, kill Palestinians, and are let off by the Israeli courts. Not to mention soldiers who the Israeli military doesn't even see fit to investigate in 99% of the cases. Now, divestment, what we can do here, one of the strategies that we can use is divestment, which was a strategy that was used against apartheid South Africa. Divestment can raise the level of awareness about how profitable Israel's occupation has become for companies around the world, and ensure that investors are not profiting from this. Some of the companies, and many of these companies are military companies that the consumer may not have a connection with, but there are ways that we can approach those companies. Companies like Alliant Tech Systems, which makes rubber-coated bullets, fuses for cluster bombs, guided multiple launch rocket systems. Boeing, which is a supplier of the F-15 Eagle and the AH-64 Apache attack helicopter. Caterpillar, which makes the D9 bulldozer, which is the type of bulldozer that killed Rachel Corrie, Olympia resident who was in Palestine trying to protect a Palestinian home from being destroyed in 2003. Cement Roadstone Holdings, which has engaged in the cement that's building the annexation wall in the West Bank. General Dynamics, which makes a diesel engine for Israel's battle tanks. The list goes on. General Electric, Globecom Systems, ITT Corporation, Lockheed Martin, Magal Security Systems, Motorola, Northrop Grumman, Oshkosh Truck Corporation, Raytheon, Silicon Graphics. These are companies that benefit and profit from the Israeli apartheid system. And that's why it's important for us here to become aware of what we're invested in personally, what our universities and churches and unions are invested in, and demanding that our investments do not go to fund apartheid. And there are ways that you can research that and find out, and I encourage everyone, if you're a part of a union, if you're a part of a church, if you're a part of a university, to begin that research and find out what investments your university or your union has. The AFL-CIO has been confronted for its investments in Israeli bonds in some of these companies. And then as consumers, we can also choose. And the important thing is if you're engaging in a consumer boycott, that you notify the company as to why you're engaging in a boycott. One of the things that came up in the protests was Starbucks. Starbucks has a CEO who is heavily invested in Israel. The company itself is not. There aren't Starbucks in Israel, but the CEO has his own investments inside, and not just investing in Israel, but investing in the Zionist project. Now, selective divestment is what we're talking about, and boycott. And why selective investment? What is it going to do? It focuses on us not profiting from Israel's occupation of Palestinian land, and involves divesting only from specific companies that play a documented role in this occupation. This is a way of stating that we will not make money from practices that we consider to violate our own basic values and beliefs, and every investor has that right. Selective divestment is not divestment from Israel, it's not divestment from Israeli companies, and it's not divestment from companies that do business with Israel. Selective divestment specifically focuses on those companies that are profiting from the illegal apartheid policies of Israel. So we have a website that we're beginning organizing with. We also have a mailing list, and I encourage you to sign up for it for the strategy meetings that we're already engaging in. The first campaign that we're trying to focus on locally is going to be Motorola, which is a company that both invests in the military aspects of the occupation. They produce fuses for bombs and cell phone infrastructure for the Israeli military in the occupied territories. They also have a consumer aspect, which many of these companies, the military companies, do not. Most of us are probably not going out and buying F-16 fighter jets, so it wouldn't be very easy for us to divest. So Motorola, however, if you are a cell phone user, you can sign a card saying, I will not buy a Motorola cell phone for these reasons, and send that to the company, and that's a way to put pressure on the companies. So I just want to end with a quote from Moshe Ayalon, who in 2003, he was an Israeli minister. He's still, I think, high up in the Israeli government. And he said, I want the Palestinian people to realize and to accept in the depth of their being that they are a defeated people. Well, I say, and we know in the depths of our being that the Palestinian people are not and will never be a defeated people. Palestinians are a people who have been victimized for too long and deserve equal rights with all people and equal rights with Israelis. Thank you.